I'm going to start with making a podcast recommendation, although not this podcast. It's quite a twee-sounding podcast. But you know, with podcasts, even when they sound twee, they can actually still be very cool. It's a podcast, isn't it? Every podcast's cool. If you found one that's really twee, it's still a podcast. You're still going to listen to it. This podcast, wait for the twee name, is called Young Again with Kirsty Young. So it does sound twee, but do not let that put you off. It's a really gorgeous, beautiful podcast. The premise of the podcast is that a not young person, does everybody know what a not young person is? A not young person is able to give their younger self some advice. They're able to reflect back on their life, and they're able to give their younger selves some much-needed advice. So just for a second, just for you to embrace this notion of a podcast, if you are a not young person, don't put your hands up, but just think about that. Think about it. Age is a spectrum. If you are a not young person, think about for a second what you would say to younger version of you. Now, don't just dismiss this idea nominally. Just give it some actual thought. When I thought about it, for me, it started slow. I didn't embrace it, and then as soon as I got going, thinking about what advice I would give to hormonally charged, idiotic 17-year-old me, there was a lot I would want to sit down and tell him. It went on and on and on. It was quite cathartic. So just think about what you might say to your younger self just for a second. Maybe even get three things you're like, if I could tell myself, my younger self, three things, what would they be? Now, if you don't fit into that category, or you don't see yourself in that category, or you don't identify in that category, you're a younger person. Don't have to put your hands up, but if you view yourself as a younger person, and I look around at the youth in the room, and I think we have some youth, think about whether you would listen. This is the question for you. Not what advice you would give, whether you would listen to older yourself when they came to give advice, or how long you would listen for. I think you would say something like, just give it me in a voicemail or something like that. You wouldn't be bothered to listen. Would you be bothered to listen? Would you be able to receive the advice? If you're not a young person giving the advice to younger you, and it's getting quite confusing just as I say it out loud, you'd know that you were going to need to be punchy with your advice. If your younger self was ever going to listen, you'd only have a few seconds, you'd need to get it in sound bites, and you'd need to make it punchy, and you'd need to make it snappy to get the message across. The podcast, Young Again with Kirsty Young, I listened to the one with Minnie Driver in it, because I'm from the 90s and everything I do is oriented around the 90s. But it's really it's gorgeous, it's rich, it's got melancholy in it, it's insightful. But one of the big takeaways from the podcast is, and other episodes are similar to this, you can live a life which really seems full, where you think you can kind of know it all and you can know everything. You can have this mindset. You can think you've got it all together, you know everything, and yet at the same time, there can be loads and loads of layers that you just can't really grasp. There can be so much more to your life than you can kind of get your head around. Life can be deeper. It can be more beautiful. And you can think that you know it all. You can exist in this space and you can think, well, I know it all. I feel like I've got it all together. I know everything that there is to know. And actually, it's perfectly true that at the same time, as we look back on our lives, we can sort of see the reality of the fact that actually, just with a couple of minutes with our younger selves, we would be able to enrich our younger selves. We would be able to say, oh, summer holidays when you're 16, that is just soak up every bit of that. That is an absolute gorgeous thing. And your first ever ice cream to your younger self, you're never going to taste anything quite like that again. There would be, and I've picked trivial examples off the top of my head. There would be such a richness that we could appreciate. There's more to life, perhaps, than we can fully grasp in the moment. I want to share with you a theory. I'd hope to have a picture, but I want you to imagine a picture of a balcony and a road. I didn't get around to organizing it in time for the tech team, so that's my bad. A guy called John McKay, he's a theologian, philosopher type. He explained, he theorized that to really live, to know the truth about who you are, there are two perspectives that you need to consider. There are two ways you need to view everything. It's called the balcony and the road. This idea that you can be up on the balcony and oversee stuff, and this idea that you're on the road in the thick of it. And what he would go on to say was that we are in the road. We live on the road day to day. We are squashed up with other people. We are influenced by the culture around us. We're stuck in the flow of life. And truth, the truth about who we are, is part of the reality of that. It's what we find out about ourselves as we go along, what we learn from our experience, from those round about us. But he also appreciated, and he got this idea from Descartes and René Descartes and other thinkers like that, the benefits to knowing who you are in life, of stepping back and being able to see your life with this idea of looking from the balcony. So you're able to get off the road of life, go up in the balcony and observe. And a lot of the thinkers around Descartes' time had this idea that you could completely withdraw yourself and just think and just be able to start from that place of just thinking independent of your actual self. And he said, McKay said, this is one of the ways that we are able to really see what life's all about. If we can step back, we can see the whole crowd of people. If you can imagine a whole busy road, somebody on the balcony looking down, if humanity is that busy road, we can see where it all starts from. We can see where it's all heading. We can see the problems of being in the crowd. We can see how we get swept along with things. We can see all this kind of thing. We can really get to appreciate life if we can do both. But his theory was, and thanks for staying with me through this theory, we can't do that. He sort of disagreed with René Descartes. He says, we can't actually get to the balcony to think completely independently and autonomously in that sense. We can't get off the road properly. And he theorized, his theory is basically, in the world that we live, we need to appreciate that we need to really grasp. There's so much more that we can't actually quite grasp and get our heads around. We're going to need help. We're going to need an extra set of eyes to maybe appreciate all that life offers. Here's a way to think about, I don't know if we can have the text on the screen, or if you can remember the story as Andy read it to us in Jonah. It's my favorite bit of Jonah. I think it's really funny. I think it's really insightful. I think it's really telling. I think it really speaks. I don't know if it washed over you. Did you notice there was a worm in the text? Did you notice some of those things? Here's a way to think about what's happening in chapter 4 of Jonah. Jonah, I think, is a guy who's very much on the road. And God, in this little text, God's word, the storyteller, starts to show God arrest his mind and get him to see life from a broader perspective, from a bigger picture. He said, you're on the road, but you need to see up from the balcony at the same time. And the conclusion of the Jonah story really asks us to consider the possibility for us that there's more to see right here today. We've not got it all down. There's more of this world. Maybe our older selves would rush back to tell us this than we can grasp right now. And we can make a few responses to that. We can say, well, I don't really believe that. I don't really believe in a God. I don't really believe that there's more layers of things to see. Or you could say, maybe as a Christian, I do believe it, but I don't see that. I don't see the layers of complexity. I don't see that as I look around. And what I'll do as we go through the text really quickly, I'll try and show you what that is and why you can believe it. Okay, so chapter 4 of Jonah. Jonah has delivered the message, and so he's been into Nineveh, and he's seen the people, at least immediately, change. And I think it's very interesting. He gets, I think the expression is, gets kind of a bit on his high horse, a bit on his judgy high horse. He goes to the edge of town. And this, I think this is really funny, and sometimes I can tell a joke that can bomb, so I might be heading down that road, but if I tell this right, you'll go, oh yeah, that's quite a funny story, all right? So I don't mind if nobody laughs out loud. I'm not offended. I'll cry myself to sleep later on, but this is a funny story. It's not my fault. It's just who I am if I don't tell it right. So it gets funnier and funnier as it goes. So he goes out of town, and he's got his judgy head on, and he's sort of looking back on Nineveh to see if basically the people can keep up their good behavior, keep their ashes in their hands and their sackcloth on, see if he can keep changing, and if God will actually relent. And the impression you get from probably everything about Jonah, but certainly what we read in that text what we hear in the text that Andy's read out, is that have you ever met somebody who's just ready to be disappointed? You ever got somebody in your life like that you think, I could come to you with a lottery win right now, and you would be disappointed with the cut of my jib. Have you ever got somebody in that life? Jonah, I think, is in this kind of headspace. He's just ready to be disappointed. He's in a pious, judgy headspace still. And he's increasingly, I think, as I read this story, getting stressed. Getting stressed with everything that's going on. He's putting up what we would probably call something like a tent, and I've done a bit of research, and it's what you would call, if you were an ancient Hebrew, a sukkah. And I'm looking at my spelling now, and I've got that very wrong. And he's putting it up on the edge of town. And he's putting it up in the edge of town, and he's looking back at Nineveh, and it's kind of the ancient Hebrew equivalent of crossing your arms with a kind of judgy, sassy face and raising your eyebrows. You know what I mean? It's the kind of thing you would do in the playground. He's there ready to be disappointed and ready to judge. And he's in this spot, and God, in this story, is going to floor him with a beautiful, hilarious, satirical object lesson. He's going to have him on his knees. He's going to flip him on his head. He's going to make his point, and he's going to make it beautifully, and I think hilariously. But you be the judge. And you can sort of imagine him as the story unfolds. The sun's out. It's a really hot part of the world. And I don't know if have you ever put a tent up? I'm not going to do a hands up. I don't know anybody if you ever see somebody putting a tent up and they're calm, they're a liar. That's what they are. They're a fraud. Don't believe it. They're making it up. It's even so the tents that we get today with all the instructions, and you can almost just flip them up. They're impossible. Tents now are impossible. We've had some of our best rows while we put some of the tents up. It's impossible. And Jonah is not putting up a tent with any instructions. The tent that he's making is out of stones and bits of cloth. He's having a stressful day. Some of the images, I Googled this, and some of the images of what we'd guess he would put up just look really daft. He's on the edge of town, and he's putting up this little hut. It's a rubbish tent. He's like a rubbish camper. That's the sort of image that we're getting. And he's getting more and more stressed, and the sun's beating down, and you've kind of got the image, as the storyteller tells it, of him not being able to quite get out the sun. He's got like a bit of sheet above his head, and then every time he turns, his leg's getting a bit sunburnt, or that kind of thing. And then his look changes. Or rather, as we're supposed to understand, and the narrator uses this word provide, God provides over and over again. God orchestrates a different story for him, just for a second. God provides, and I love the it doesn't describe what actually tree this is, it just says a leafy tree. God provides him with a leafy tree, like a soothing, shady balm, just to comfort him. And you can imagine Jonah just going from being, and I'm guilty of this, I can go from being really stressed to being really, actually everything's all right with the world, and I can really flip, probably quite annoyingly for those around me. I can be really stressed and quite grumpy, then I have a Twix, and everything's back together again. And it's a bit like that for Jonah. All of a sudden, he's just like, I feel a whole lot more comfortable now. Actually, this is great. And it's not just that. Actually, there's a bit of it. If you look through the Old Testament, if you are under the shade and you're over the city, you're actually in a bit of an exalted position, and he's feeling a bit more like a king. The kings would sit under the shade, under the great trees. And he's almost thinking to himself, has God given me this tree? Is everything going right for me? Am I in an exalted position? And he starts to just feel a bit happier about life. Actually, he says, this is the most excited he gets in the whole story about the tree, which is interesting when you think about it. He's really quite happy. And then, as far as I can figure out, it seems like he has a good night's sleep, at least until the morning. But then he wakes up, and then it gets, as I imagined the story, and there's probably a more contemporary character than this to sort of pin this around, but I had Basil Fawlty in my head, like just incredibly, and I'm sorry if you've missed that generationally. I did ask my kids, and they said Ross from Friends was equally stressed, but that's not even the right generation now. But, imagine a stressed character. It's got that Basil Fawlty vibe, where he's freaking out and everything going wrong. He wakes up, the sun's in his eyes, and then comically, tragically, really, I think, annoyingly for him, God's provided a worm. Again, notice in the text, and God is orchestrating this whole thing, God provided a worm, and the worm is eating the shady, leafy tree, and Jonah is hacked off with the worm. He's really annoyed. Then, notice what God does next. If that's not enough, he's already stressed. He's stressed out of his box, tearing his hair out. Then God says, I'm going to provide you, Jonah, on this very stressful day when you thought all the world was coming right with a scorching wind. God provides it, and it just sends Jonah over the edge. He's just out of bed, if you can imagine it. I don't know. Nobody wakes up camping happy, I don't think. He wakes up, he's cooking in the heat, and he's hanging on to his tent with his hand. It's like the tent is blowing away. That's the image I get. And as I was thinking about this, it reminded me of the last time we went camping as a child. We went camping as a family. It was the last. We had a moment which was the last time. My mum said, that's the last time we're ever doing that. And we went on to this campsite. It was in Scarborough. It was a very regular mundane holiday. And one night the wind blew, and it blew our awning off. My dad went outside, only in his underpants, don't want to create too strong an image, and he was hanging onto it, literally hanging onto the awning, and my mum shouted, furious, "Get inside," is what she said. And when my dad came inside, he said, "We are never, ever doing this again," and we never went in a caravan ever again after that. And this is where Jonah's at. He's just he's just in this farcical situation. He's getting sunburnt. He thought everything was coming together, and in a morning, everything has fallen apart. And he shouts out to the heavens. Can you see it in the text? And it's funny. It's a bit like a toddler would shout out, is how I imagine this. He shouts out, "I have had enough. I am sick. This is getting ridiculous. Today is ridiculous. I want to die." And I think he's serious. And at the same time, I've got like a tot screaming out in my head. You know, there's just this, I've had enough of this. I'm so fed up. And then God speaks with the tone of a parent who's dealing with a tot in this moment at something ridiculous. I don't know if it's been a while since I've had my tots, but occasionally they can say really ridiculous things. I'm sure for those of you with tots tonight, maybe you've had that experience. I remember once my kid saying to me, "I don't want to get out of the supermarket, I want to stay in the supermarket," and then screaming just at this logic, "Oh, I want his beard. I just want his beard. I want to grab his beard." You know, like something ridiculous like that. And that's how God speaks to Jonah, like he's a ridiculous tot. He's like, "Is it reasonable that you are this angry about this leaf?" And Jonah says, "Yes, it is," like a toddler. "Yes, this is completely reasonable. I am livid about the leaf that has died. I am livid that I can't hold on to this man's beard. I am livid that we are not staying in the supermarket overnight." It's that level of satire and that level of nonsense. And in that moment, the story flips and God has got him, and the storyteller has got us. And the satire, as I see it in the story, has kind of reached a pinnacle point. Jonah's short-term, selfish perspective, small worldview, is there seen. It's out in the open for everyone to hear and God to be able to point out. And God says to him, "You're concerned about the plant, Jonah. Let me make my point about Nineveh while you're in this strop about the plant. You're upset because it didn't do what it was supposed to do, but it's a plant. It's quite a small, insignificant thing, and it only, in the big scheme of things, it only really affected you. And yet, God doesn't say this, but words of this effect, you went crazy. You lost your mind about this. You were furious about this." And then he hits him, and Jonah's got no comeback. Jonah's got to hear it because God's got him. He's exposed him. How much more should I care if you're this concerned? And we'll look at what the word concerned means a bit later, really interesting. If you're this concerned about this leafy plant, how much more should I be concerned with this city of Nineveh that has just happened to be where people live, where people walk around, where people trade, where people steward their things, where there is so much potential for good, a city that has got such great influence across the world that's also not doing what it is made for, where so many people will innocently grow up and inherit bad values. Should I not do something about that? Is the end of the story. A couple of brief points about what I think is a brilliant story. Nobody's laughing themselves to sleep, but I heard a few giggles, so I'm gently encouraged. First thing I think that we learn from that story is it reminds us, it exposes in us how fixated we can get on really shallow, temporary things. And I don't think God here in his story beats us over the head with it. I think what the story really says is, you really ought to think about that. Just think about how fixated, how all-consumed it's possible for you to get about stuff that really doesn't matter. And it's almost one of them levers where I'm preaching and I think I just need to sort of say that bit, and I know that all of us have got stuff where we think, actually, yeah, man, that is so true for me. And we can have these moments in our lives of like we come to a crisis, something really bad happens, somebody gets really ill, something like that, and we're able to see, we'll be at a funeral or something like that, and we'll say, man, don't know why we get so het up about that. We get these moments, these rare glimpses of how consumed we get by sort of little things. But for the most part, our lives are chock-a-block. At least my life easily gets chock-a-block with stuff that's just temporary. It's not just about a leafy plant, but it's of that ilk. And God, I think, would say to me, man, you need to think bigger. You need to think outside the box. And that's kind of the message of Jonah. Jonah's not just to point out how limited and flawed our perspectives are, but how much richer and fuller God's are, ours can be. When we hear God say he's concerned for Nineveh, we think perhaps he's got a skewed memory or a skewed version of things, or he's got a short memory or something like that. But we're challenged. The point of the story is that we're challenged to think that actually, in terms of Nineveh, it's not that God's got a short-term memory. It's not that he's got a skewed vision of things. He just sees the truth about Nineveh. He's able to look at that city, those people, and see it in its complete truth. He's able to see the full picture. He doesn't just see what's happening right now and how bad they are right now. He's able to get up onto the balcony. This is one thing we can learn about our God. He's got that view where he can see over the whole thing. He can still see in those, what had become pretty evil Ninevites, what they were created for. When Jonah sees all this evil coming out of these people, God still looks on these people and he still starts with, well, they were made for good. They were made by me. They were purposed for good. He still sees in and amongst that evil city the innocent people that are going to get dragged along. He sees, if you like, the injustice within the injustice before the injustice. He sees the potential for good in that city still. He sees the potential for that city to pass on greater good to the world. And he knows, because he sees the view from the balcony, that it's possible for those people to still turn around. And he knows, because he has the view from the balcony, how gorgeous and beautiful, maybe even more beautiful, that would look in the big scheme of things. God has this picture. Every time God looks at a place, either in our hearts, our community, the evil baddies that we know down the road, God sees, and the story hits us with, God sees the full picture. Not just, I had in my notes at the start, God has a broader view of things. And that's not quite right. God has a fuller, more truthful view of things. But that's not all that God sees. And this is where it starts to become good news for humanity and not just a weird tale about a man that was in a fish. God's not just a distant philosopher. What do we know about this story? He's not just up on the balcony. That's not the only perspective that God has. God gets down on the road. When we see Jesus come, we don't see God just distant and philosophical and throwing views at us. We see a God who gets his hands dirty, who gets dragged along by people, who does things he doesn't want to do, who sees the worst in people, who knows exactly what it's like to be a human being, exactly how horrible people can be. And the beautiful thing about our God is that he's both of those things. And this is where I think the story gets really gorgeous and really poignant. And we read in the story that God sees Nineveh. He sees people like that, having been through all of that with the perspectives that he's got, and he's concerned. So concerned was the only real word that I did a bit of digging around in to see what it actually meant, and it's got a gorgeous meaning. When we read there that God is concerned for the Ninevites, the literal meaning is to look with tears in your eyes. God sees the apathy, the nastiness, the evilness, the downright horribleness, the lostness that would make Jonah and all of us turn away from somebody like that. And yet God looks at those people with tears in his eyes. That is God's view. And that's not to lead us down a path of thinking that God just lets everybody away with everything. He's not just a liberal in that sense. We read in the story, we know what the story is. Jonah comes with judgment. He comes with a message of judgment. This place is going to get destroyed, but he comes with that message with a God who has tears in his eyes. This is the view that God has of people. Imagine for a second that we could see people like that. Imagine that was your view of your spouse, of your family, of your community, of your boss, of the baddies that annoy us in another part of the world, of the people that are not like us. Imagine God gets us to think, if you could see people like that, you're able to be truthful with them, you're able to be real with them, and yet at the same time as you're able to do that, even with people that you don't like, you're able to be full of compassion, see where they've come from, still see the potential in them. Do you know when somebody drives you mad, how all that just falls away? All the possibilities for them fall away. Where they've come from falls away. It's the first stuff to go, isn't it? Don't care where you've come from. Don't care what you could possibly do. I just don't like you. And God, this is part of the message of Jonah. God says, I can't shift that view. Even of the horrible Ninevites, I still see them like that. And I think there's two reasons that should bring our hearts some joy. God says to us, you need to know that that is the view I hold of everyone. Can't shift that view. When I look at people, I see their full potential. I see what they were created to do. I see how easily it can be for them to get dragged astray. And as we hear, or as we be challenged by the fact that God sees people like that, we may be challenged ourselves to think about how we're able to look at people. And the other thing that I think the story says that we really need to hear is that God sees us in that same way too. God looks at us however we come to him, however mixed up and messed up that we've got. And it's beautiful, and I need that every now and again. I know God says, I know why you were made. I know the potential for you. I know how easily you can get led astray, and yet I still look at you with tears in my eyes. And as I've just dropped it there, I realize I've given you this gorgeously idealistic view. And part of what I'm saying is look at how God looks at the world. Look at how we're able to look at the world. And I know just as I say that, we've got loads to do to get ready for tomorrow morning. We've got a stressful next 24 hours. You will have exactly the same. And you'll be saying things like, maybe in the back of your minds, or people will be saying things like, I don't know if I can see that. I don't know if I'm ready to look at the world like that. I don't know if I believe that I've got to look at people and accept that they've got layers of complexity and still love them. I don't know if we can be so idealistic about things. That's a very reasonable thing to think. And that will, I'm sure, having preached this message, that will be what will clutter my mind this week. That will be my trouble this week, is thinking about those things. And at the same time as I'm troubled by that, and I think, man alive, can this really be true? Is this really a hope that we have? Is this realistic? Should I just dismiss it? The Bible story's got this gorgeous power that we see in Jesus. He doesn't just teach it on the mountain. He doesn't just eloquate it. He doesn't just speak it to us, but he lives it out. And he doesn't just speak it and live it out, but he also makes it possible on the cross. Because on the cross is the place where we see too, as we want to dismiss it, that we too have got a backstory that needs grace. And we don't only see that we've got a backstory that needs grace, but we also see that we've got a future full of hope. And in that hit, there's a glimpse of the balcony. What's the view that you have?